Please welcome our final speaker of the day, Charles Allen, a senior consulting manager. Today, he will be presenting how to track changes to your data. Please stick around after Charles's session for a live Q&A.
Hello, this is Charles Allen. Welcome to this Dynamics Con presentation. I'm very happy to be here today and hoping to provide a lot of great content for my fellow Dynamics GP users out there. Today is a great session that I really like because it's talking about tracking activity in GP. And this is something that we get occasionally from people who really need it, but unfortunately, they usually need it after it's already occurred. So what we're going to talk about are some options you have in GP and a little bit outside GP to track activity. Now, as we go along, by all means, if you have a question, just put it in the chat window and we'll get to it. There's not going to be a lot of stuff that we should not be able to cover, but if you have any particular requests or questions, put them in there and we'll take care of them at the end. So let's go ahead and start talking about what we're going to do in this session. And the first one is the title, Tracking Changes. Now, when we say changes, as you know, you enter data in a window and then you come back and you update that data. Maybe you're inserting new records, maybe you're deleting records. Inserts, deletes, and updates. Those are the types of activities we want to be able to track. So if somebody says, well, I didn't do that, or hey, I was at home sick that day, this is a way that you can track that activity to make sure that people are not updating data incorrectly or, in worst case, maliciously. Just as an aside, we had a client many years ago who all of a sudden reported issues in their sales order module, and they were not getting historical data. All of a sudden, when we start running queries, we're looking at data. Turns out that a power user simply unchecked a box to keep history. Case solved, but had we known that, it would have saved us a lot of angst at the time, and it would have also enabled us to go see on this day, at this time, this user made that change. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover in this session today about tracking changes. So here's our agenda. We're going to look at activity tracking. This is a very low-hanging fruit type of option. It's built into GP. You don't have to do anything special other than get it set up and start using it. The second thing is HR and payroll. Now, obviously, if you're a payables person, you probably don't care about that. But if you're an HR and payroll, you definitely want to know how the system tracks that information. And then third, detailed payroll activity tracking. This is something that some people don't realize exists, but it's extremely helpful and doesn't cost anything. You just have to get it implemented. And last but not least, one of my favorite subjects these days is custom triggers. And we're going to show an example of that and talk about why that can be so powerful and how you can do it. Again, none of this requires any third parties. It's all with the stuff right off the shelf, so it should be a lot easier for you to implement. So let's get started with activity tracking. All right. As we said, it's part of GP. Nothing extra. It's already installed. You don't even have to install anything. It is maintained in the System Setup menu. Now, we're going to be taking a look at that here in a little bit in GP, but it is maintained in a System Setup. However, like everything, you have to enable it before you use it. okay? Because once the cat or the cow has left the barn, it's too late to go back, right? So you need to turn it on first so you can start tracking activity. And there are multiple categories of activities that you can track. You'll see that there are 5 different categories. And within each one of those, there are options of what you can do. So let's take a look at what those options are. The first one is log in, log out activity. Now this can be helpful if you need to know if people are logging in outside their normal work hours. We have had requests around this very topic recently. So with people working remotely especially, if they are supposed to be working from 8 to 5 and then they're not because they're going shopping or whatever during the day, or of course they may be doing other important things to them personally, we still need to know, are they working during daylight hours or whenever they're supposed to be working? So log in, log out activity can be useful to track that information. The second one is access tracking. What are they doing when they get into GP? Are they opening this window? Are they posting these transactions? Are they running these reports? What are they doing? So you'll be able to set up that type of tracking in GP for that type of access information. The third is file tracking. Now, this is we'll call it the traditional poor man's version of tracking. And the reason I say that is because you can track that people are creating a record or deleting a record or even updating a record. What you don't get is exactly what they did. So it might say that Charles added vendor ABC. But if I go and update vendor ABC and change address 1, it's not going to tell me that I updated address 1 to now be my personal address. So it doesn't do that, but it will tell you that Charles did update that address. Okay. Process tracking, if we want to track that somebody posted information, and then posting and processing. You'll see those when we get into GP and what the differences are between those. So let's go take a look at an example of what you can track in an inquiry window, and then we'll go look and set it up inside GP. So if you look on my window, you'll see it's showing for all my users some of the activity. So you'll notice that it says, hey, a vendor maintenance window was successfully opened. Tells me who did it, when they did it, what time they did it. Okay. The vendor's window was successfully opened, again, twice by the same person. Also, I ran an age trial balance, or that user did, and then printed the aging report. So those are some examples of the activity that you can track in the system. So let's go set up inside GP what that looks like. So we're going to launch GP here, and we're going to go to administration, and we're going to go to system, and scroll down just a little bit, activity tracking. All right, so log in, log out. You can see that we can track failed attempts to log in. If you suspect people may be trying to log in and as other people, then that's a great thing to turn on. And then you can track successful attempts to log in or log out. Again, if you want to make sure people are working when they're supposed to be, that's what you can use this option for. Now, once you're in here, notice you do need to check the bots to track it. You need to check the user, and then you need to check the company. If you've got 20 companies, you can do mark all, so you don't have to check them individually, but you do need to check them. And then you do that for each user. Notice if I go to SA, they're not activated. Okay, so you got to do that for all your users. Fortunately, it's easy, but it is a little bit tedious. Let's go to access tracking. Failed attempts to open a window, to print a report, to access a file. Successful attempts. And then some other options here. So again, if you want to track them all, just hit mark all, and then go to your users, and there it is. So you can see that Bubba is already activated, and now it's going to start tracking some additional information. If we go down to file tracking, now we're talking about if I'm adding, deleting, or creating records. Or I'm sorry, not creating, updating. So we have additions, deletions, and as we scroll down, modifications. But remember, it's going to tell you that Charles updated vendor ABC, but it's not going to tell you what Charles did to vendor ABC. Okay? But it does have a way for you to at least know that. Processes, file maintenance, like check lanes or sales or payroll tax updates. Routines. Did you run a routine to remove paid transactions and receivables? Did you run a utility to remove records from history? All right, so you can track all that information. And last but not least, we have posting. So all of the different types of activities, financial, sales, inventory, payroll, and project. Okay. So all these options are available to you. You just have to turn them on. Then once you are ready to go and do it and track people actually making changes, go down to inquiry, go to activity tracking, and make that a little bit bigger. And now you can see we've got some information. Now here's an example where we modified a vendor window, but notice it doesn't tell you what was changed. Okay. Here we have where we're adding data to a transaction work file. Now, if you are going to track changes to transactions or additions to transactions, be prepared to go in and purge this data once in a while because it's going to get really big if you have a lot of activity. All right? So make sure you purge your activity if you are tracking data at a transaction level. You still may need to purge it occasionally anyway, but especially if you have that transaction activity. Okay? You can print this, and of course, this is data that's in a table. So if you don't like this window and you prefer to be able to use a smart list instead, you can always create a smart list to give you the same information. Okay? All right, so let's hit OK to that. And you'll notice over here under utilities, you've got activity detail. So here is where we can actually remove that activity. Okay? So some issues. Again, you must enable it before you use it. So turn it on now, and then it'll start tracking from this point going forward. Doesn't always provide the details of what you need in that activity. Okay? It'll get you started, but it's not going to tell you exactly what happened. And also, you all need to remember if you add new users in GP, you've got to go enable it for them. Okay? So keep that in mind. Just put it in your checklist when you add a new user. Benefits, easy to implement. You saw what we had to do. We just had to check some boxes, and we could even just hit mark all. You can't get much easier than that. And then built-in inquiries and reports, and then the ability to add your own. So pretty simple, but if you need more, again, let me know. And at the end, when we get to our last section, you'll see that there's some things we can do. Now, talking also about the problem of enabling it for new users, remember with GP, we're talking about data in a database. So you could create some routines through SQL to populate that activity tracking. So if you're constantly adding new users, you don't have to necessarily remember to do it, but you would have to create something custom in SQL to do it for you. Okay? So there's a benefit to GP in that you do have that ability, but you would have to do it and find somebody who can do it if you don't have that skill yourself. All right, so that's activity tracking. Again, if you have any questions about it, just put them in the chat window. We'll answer them and go forward from there. Let's go on to the next topic, which is human resources and payroll history. Now, this is a very big deal if you're in HR and payroll, because if you want to be able to go back and say, okay, on this day, we promoted this person and we put them in this position, and then, we also gave them a salary raise. You want to be able to track that information so you can go back in time and see when things changed. These activities are natively inside GP. And since human resources is now part of GP and doesn't have to be licensed separately, there's no reason to not implement HR, even if you're not going to use most of the HR functionality. But it does provide a lot of functionality for tracking information. Let's talk about what our options are in HR and payroll. So the first thing is it tracks a variety of changes, and you're going to see that when we get to the windows, of course. The second thing is employment history. Now, this is the first window we're going to look at. This is a window that's only been in GP for maybe about 2 or so versions, depending upon how you depending on how you classify the current version. Is it one version or is it 2 versions? At any rate, the employment history is fairly new to GP. We'll take a look at that and make sure you know it's there. They did make some enhancements to it, as well as the employee maintenance window in the last version of GP, or the latest version. So we'll talk about those here in a moment. Position history. As we promote people or put them in different departments or put them in a different location, we want to be able to track that position change and why it was made. So we're going to show you that window. And then last but not least, we're going to talk about the earnings history. Now it says earnings on the menu, but we're really talking about salary changes. Okay? You may know that when you go to the employee pay code maintenance window and you record a pay change, sometimes you get prompted for the reason for that change. Well, that information that you put into that window is going to go into that earnings history window. All right? So if you don't get that question, let me know. Put in the chat window. We'll show you why that may be. You also need to check your HR preferences in the system setup menu, okay? Because that can control those reasons as well, and can even prevent people from having to put in a reason. If you do want to track reasons and make sure that every time a pay rate is changed for an employee, make sure that you don't allow people to cancel out of that window. All right? Let's go take a look here. All right. The employment history, this window, which is available from the employee maintenance window, and then the go-to, and then payroll. This window will track changes to employee data, new hires, terminations by that inactive checkbox, changes to dates. And if you'll notice on the screen there, you can see we've got an employee with 3 records. 1, he was hired. 2, he wasn't sure he's going to stick around. I've been in companies where you'd have an employee who came in for breakfast and left at lunch. So he wasn't sure if he's going to stick around. And then lastly, moving on. So decided, this job's not for me. I'm going to move on. But a lot of companies, of course, have people that come and go either for seasonal purposes or some other reason. And they want to know, has that person worked here? So this window will show that. All right, so let's go into GP and we'll take a look. So we're going to go to HR and payroll. We're going to go to employee. We're going to pull up an employee. Go to payroll, employment history. Now you do not need to pick an employee first, but if I go to the employment history under payroll, there it is, and it defaults to the employee that I selected, but I can pick another employee right here. If I were to pick Ackerman, notice it just has that this person was hired. So notice here it's got the reason or what was changed, the hire date, adjusted hire date, date inactivated, last day worked, and term date. Okay? And then it's got the reason for change. Now, GP did make some changes. You notice that moving on right there, that reason code. If I were to pull up another employee, so notice right here, it's got a reason code is grayed out. That's the way we remember it working. If I come over here and I'll say, well, this person is left as of 8/15/2027, now I can put in a reason. Okay, we'll say better pastures. All right, and then save it. Now, if we go back to our employment history, we'll pull up that employee, and there it is right there. So very simple. It's going to track all that activity changes from the employee master table. And then you can come in here. And of course, again, you notice there's no print option anywhere, but you can create a smart list if you need to, or a SQL report to print that information. All right. Let's talk about the next one, which is employment history. I'm sorry, smart list. First, I'm on that one. That is a smart list that is available to you today in GP. So you don't have to create it. It's already there. Okay. All right, now let's talk about position and salary history in HR. So position history is going to track things like division changes, department changes, position, supervisor. You can see everything that's listed. So anytime you make a change to one of those fields on the employee maintenance window, it's going to create that historical record. You can also edit that position history. And you'll see why in a moment, because even though that window doesn't show a whole lot, there may be some additional information you need to store about that historical record. So we're going to show you how to edit that data. And the table I list there because a lot of times companies need that information for whatever reason. So the table there, the HR2 EMPO2, is the table that stores that information. Now for the earnings history, that's all your salary history. That's of course changing or tracking all the changes to your pay. And there's the table for that. So if you want to create a smart list or a report, that's the table you're going to use. Or if you're doing it through Smart List Designer or Smart List Builder, you won't use that table name. You would actually use the information, the spelled out version. Let's go take a look in GP. So there are different ways to get to those windows. But if I go here, go to Employee, let's go to Earnings History. So here it's showing me an employee who got a cost of living increase. Notice I've got two records. It's giving me one for my base pay, which I changed, and then one for another pay code, which is based on this pay. So all the pay codes that are based on the pay code that you change will also get salary changes as well. Okay, tells me who did it, tells me when it happened, and what the effective date is. Okay, so if we go here to, let's go to pay code, and let's pull up Ackerman, and let's pull up salary again, and let's go ahead and put in another pay increase. Hit save. We'll say yes to roll down. Here's our effective date of the change, so we'll say 04/15, and we'll put in why not. Hit OK. We'll add that change reason. Now, you can control who has access to those change reasons as far as adding new ones or deleting them. So make sure you do that so people can't just make up their own reasons, unless you want them to, of course. And now let's go back to that window. Let's pull up Ackerman. And there it is. So here's that 30,000 right there. And there's our reason. All right. Notice the go-to just takes you to other windows. So you can't really edit this data, except you can edit the reason. So if you forgot to put a reason, you can edit the reason code. But you can't change anything else on this window. Okay. But of course, this is a table, and I provided that in the previous slide. So you can, if you have security and you have a reason, you can go change that data if you need to. So that's salary history. Now let's look at position history. Now, as I said earlier, this is data that you can edit. So let's pull up. So here's Pilar Ackerman. There's not a lot of data showing on this window, as you can plainly see. But there is more data behind the scenes. And you can edit it. Notice you have new, so you can add new values or new records. You can zoom in to this one. Let's go ahead, and you can even delete. Let's go ahead and double click. And now notice, not only can you change this information, which is visible here, but you can also change this information here. So this is a great way, especially if you're loading in data from another system. You can put in all their position history. And if you're trying to make sure that your data in GP is going to be good, you can go ahead and you can track that information and then edit it if you need to. Again, from a security standpoint, you want to make sure that the people who are doing this have the rights, and that other people who should not be doing it do not have the rights. So make sure in your tasks and your roles set up in GP that you assign this information very detailed wise. Okay. All right. So let's close this. Now again, remember, new, zoom to change, delete to delete. Exactly what it says. All right. So be careful, but you can edit this. And of course, again, you can create your own reports using SmartList or any other tool. All right. So again, these are screenshots of what we just saw showing position and salary changes. All right. Let's talk about the next one, because the next one is something that a lot of people don't even know exists, but it can be implemented. Now, I will say, because of changes to customer source that are coming, if you have a problem getting this, just reach out to us and we'll be happy to provide it to you. It's free, so there's no harm in getting it. There's no registration key or anything like that. This is technically part of the Professional Services Tools Library. If that is also a new term to you, please reach out, because there's a lot of great features in that utility. That's also known as Pistol, spelled shortly. So again, Professional Services Tools Library. It's also free, but it does need to be installed. And it can be installed from your GP media that's downloaded. We have a webinar that we did a long time ago on this, maybe a couple of years ago, and we'll be happy to share information about Pistol with you. But let's talk about this particular feature, which is Detailed Payroll Activity Tracking. We talked about activity tracking earlier, and the issue with that is it doesn't track everything. It doesn't track a lot of the details you may want. So what this does is you might say it complements or supplements activity tracking. It also complements or supplements the HR activity. Let's talk about what is in this. As I said, it's free. It provides tracking for changes to certain tables. Now, you'll notice down below, we're going to talk about these tables. I'm going to show you a slide showing you a list of tables that are being maintained. We'll talk about that in a little bit more detail here coming up. Every change you make to these tables that we'll show in the next slide is going to go into a new table called Track Payroll Changes. And that is a table that you can then use in custom reports, such as Smart List or Excel reporting or SQL reporting or something else. Track Payroll Changes. Now, you will need to give people rights to that table for them to be able to access it from a reporting standpoint. The way it works is when somebody enters data into one of these tables that you'll see here shortly, it's going to create a record in Track Payroll Changes. And it does that by using what are called triggers. Triggers, if you don't know what they are SQL Server queries that perform functions when something happens. So it's triggered, right? We know what that word means. So when I put in a new employee and save it, it triggers the creation of a record in Track Payroll Changes. Now, every table that I'll show you has a trigger added to it for these changes. You can modify these triggers. You can also create your own triggers to track additional changes. So let's say I wanted to track information about discipline. Then I can add a trigger for tracking discipline changes. And, really any HR payroll table I want to track, we can do that by modifying or adding additional triggers. Now, you do have to have SQL Server knowledge to do that, or know somebody who has SQL Server knowledge. Sometimes, again, it's not what you know, but who you know. And as I say at the bottom, you can create reports against this Track Payroll Changes using a variety of tools. So let's talk about what tables are included. Well, I won't name them all, but you can see what they are. They're the most common employee maintenance fields there are, or tables, that is. So again, if you need more tables, that's where a SQL person comes in. All right, so let me show you behind the scenes what this looks like. And let's open this. We're going to go down to our UPR tables for payroll. And here we go. So let's start with UPR 100, triggers. There we go. Track employee additions, track employee changes. So these were created automatically. Not automatically, by the installation of that third party or that tool. And if I script this out, you can see what it's doing is it's tracking who the user was, the table that was changed. It's saying that was an inserted record because we're tracking additions. The date, which is the current date. And then a couple of other things for inserted and inserted again. Who the employee was. And it says in the message, employee was added. So if we look at our data, let me just query that table. Notice over here, employee was added right here. Okay. And you can see the inserted records, the employee ID right here, the date, the column name it was inserted, and so on. Now for one that was changed, let's go ahead and do that one. A little bit different. And you can see we have a whole lot of choices here. So if they update the class, notice it's tracking which column is being changed, and then it's got a specific description for that. And if we change the inactive checkbox, there it is, and so on and so forth. So if you said, well, gosh, there's a field on the employee maintenance window that I want to be able to track, we can add to this trigger that particular field and really just copying and pasting and then editing that additional information. Okay? Not hard, but something to do. Again, you do have to have SQL Server knowledge to do this. All right. Now, this table, track payroll changes, just like the activity, can get pretty big because especially if you think about a new employee and all the data you're adding for a new employee, that's going to create a lot of records. So over time, you may want to purge this table. Now, to purge the table, you're going to have to do it through SQL Server because there's no built-in utilities inside GP. And it would be basically like using a delete statement in SQL. Now, this is an example, as I just showed, of the data here. Okay? So you can see the types of information it's going to track. You can build a smart list. Now, if you have a smart list designer, what you need to do is create a SQL view based on the table, and then you can build a smart list using that view. Okay? If you have a smart list builder from E1, you can give access to that specific table and then build a report straight from it. And if you're using something like SQL Server reporting services, again, you would access the table itself. All right. So again, detailed payroll activity. It's free. Just contact me if you need it and need help implementing it. And it will track information. If you've got multiple companies with payroll data, by all means, install it against all your companies with payroll data. Custom triggers. I really like this, and I'm really getting into custom triggers these days because they're so powerful and can be fairly easy. Again, it does require SQL Server knowledge to create, but they can be very straightforward or they can be really complex. It just depends on what you're trying to do and what you want to do. So let's talk about what custom triggers can do for you. They can be created to track any changes in GP. Any changes. If I want to track that somebody edited a GL account, I can do it. If I want to track that somebody made a change to a vendor, I can do it. Anything you want. Basically, every table in GP can have a trigger added to it. All right. Now, the next cool thing is it can track changes that are done inside GP as well as outside GP. So let's say somebody comes and runs a query to update data behind the scenes. You still want to know that somebody made those changes. So these triggers can track that information for you. Whereas activity tracking that we saw at the beginning only tracks activity inside GP. Triggers, because they're database level, can track any changes in the database. It does require some expertise. As I said, it requires somebody to have SQL Server knowledge to do this. And I'm going to show you an example of one here in a minute. And if you don't know SQL, that's okay. We're going to talk about what it's doing. And then as long as you understand what you want to do, then you can talk to a developer and say, hey, Bill, every time somebody changes the data in this field on this window, I want to create a record of it. And then the developer can go and create that trigger for you. That last point about being used by auditing active applications, we'll get the word out. There are tools such as Rockton, Auditor, and then there used to be a tool from GP for doing auditing. It's now offered by a third party, but they operate by using triggers. Okay. All right, so let's take a look at the makings of a custom trigger. As you can see, this is for demo purposes. This is a very streamlined trigger. If you are going to put a trigger into effect, by all means, test, 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 right? Don't do anything in your system without testing first. All right? Very, very important. So the best thing is to have a test company or even a test environment. It's even better. Okay, but anyway, let's take a look at this. If you can see it, we'll walk through it. This trigger is going to track changes to the vendor name. That's all it's doing. So it's pretty simple. But let's take a look and see what it's doing. So it's tracking changes on PM200. That's our vendor table, vendor master table. For updates, so it's tracking specifically changes to the table, not new vendors, not deleted vendors, changes to vendors. Okay? All right, so that's what we're doing. We're starting out by saying create this trigger on this table for updates. Now, here's our actual query. If the vendor name was updated, then do this. We're going to insert a record into this table. So I created a custom table called PM00200 underscore changes. That's going to track all the changes to the vendor name. Then what is going to go into that table? Well, it's going to track who the vendor was, what was deleted or what was changed, and what was changed to. So change from, change to. And you'll notice all this stuff at the bottom. Really in SQL, an update is deleting data and then replacing it with new data. So that's why you see deleted and inserted here. So it's selecting data from the deleted information and then it's pulling in the inserted information. And it's only doing it where the vendor that was involved in the deletion is also the vendor involved in the insertion. Okay, because we're deleting data from a vendor and replacing it with new data for the same vendor. Okay, so let's go take a look in SQL so you can see that. All right, so it looks like I don't have that handy, so let's go find that up here. All right, so go to triggers. There it is right there. We're going to right click, script it, create it, and there it is. So now this is tracking information about changes to our vendor name. It's the same thing you just saw on the slide. Okay? But basically I created this right here. All this other stuff came in just by scripting it. All right. So if we could add that, we could add to this just like we had in the employee changes where they had a series of items. We're doing the same thing here. So here I could keep adding section after section for different fields. So let's go try that. We're going to go over here and we're going to go to cards, purchasing vendor, and we're going to go to advanced office systems. So we're going to come over here. We're going to say office systems new. Be very clever. And we're going to hit save. All right, simple. So now I've got a smart list I created. Let's go take a look at that. Go to purchasing. Vendor name changes right here. So there it is. So here's my vendor. Here's the old name. Here's the new name. Just like that. And you can see it really did not add any time. Now, you usually get in trouble with triggers when you're inserting a lot of data. So if you're importing a lot of vendors, that's something you may want to turn off for then, and then turn it back on when you're done. Okay, so you don't want to hamper speed of processing. And we're done. Again, if you have any questions, put them in the chat window. We'll get them answered. And thank you very much for attending this session. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming to our session today. If you have any additional questions about what we covered, feel free to ask or put them in the chat window and we will get them answered. So hopefully, as some people pointed out, you do want to make sure that you document everything you do so that if your system goes down, which happens, then people are able to restore what you have created. All right, so let's see if anybody does have any questions at the end of a long day on a Thursday. And as I did note in the chat window, there's an additional audit trail solution from FastPath, which is an organization that creates a whole bunch of other great products. So feel free to check out FastPath, check out Rockton, and there are probably other solutions out there. And of course, one of the great things about GP is that because it is SQL Server based, you have the ability to do a whole lot behind the scenes. So it's something which you can use and take advantage of pretty easily and sometimes even inexpensively, which is always good. So let's talk about some of the things we've discussed. Some of the things, of course, are built right into GP. The ability to do activity tracking is something that you can turn on pretty quickly. And this is something that a lot of people come to us after the horse has left the barn, so to speak. So it's something you can turn on now and then put it in your, let's say, year-end or even month-end procedures to go and clear that activity if it's getting too big. You don't want to get ready to do a upgrade or a year-end update or something like that and then realize your activity table is half of the size of your entire database. So make sure you edit that table, clear it out, and of course you are going to turn it on. It's good to look at it and at least make sure that it's working once in a while. But it is a free, and not free, but built-in tool. It's free in the sense that you already have it. And then, of course, all the HR and payroll activity is built into GP. Nothing we covered there is added or special. One thing is, of course, HR has been available as part of the GP license for a while now. But if you don't have HR implemented, there's no reason not to get it added into your system because that just adds functionality at no additional cost, including the stuff that we discussed. And then certainly, again, the ability to use the professional services tools kit and the query for tracking payroll activity is, again, something for which you do not have to pay additional dollars to Microsoft. You just have to get it implemented. And it's a very quick deal. Now, we did have a question about finding the size of the activity table. So that's a great question. To get the size, you're going to need to go into your SQL Server and use SQL Server Management Studio. And when you do that, go to your Dynamics database and look for the SY0, I believe it's 50,000, SY0 5000 table. And if you right-click on that, you can go to the properties, and then you can see the size of that table. And you can do that with any GP table. And then there are other ways to do this, but that's the way I normally do things. So right-click on the table and go and see what the database size is. From a cleanup, as I said, you want to use a delete statement to clear. I'm sorry. As I said in the demo, you actually do that through GP. Technically speaking, you could also do it through SQL. So if you want to have just a regular old GP user do it, feel free to do that through the interface. But you can also do things through SQL as well, including automating items. All right. Thank you, Belinda. All right. And Doug is saying he did find the download, and that download does work, I believe, with the later versions of 18.2, 18.3. So you can use that same zip file for the later versions. And so I'm not sure, Doug, on the question. Okay, I think, Doug, you answered your own question about obtaining the utilities. So great. If anybody does have a question, though, about getting that payroll activity tracking, by all means, you can send me your information, and I'll be happy to send it to you. Or if you can get into Customer Source to go download that, that's the place to go. All right, let's see if we have any other good questions here. All right, so in newer versions, there is a fellow GPer is commenting that you can put in change tracking on tables and then use SQL queries to see those changes. Okay. So if you want to do that, that is an option. Of course, you do have to be a SQL person to enable that, but by all means, check out that as an option or talk with your database administrator about that. All right. And then, of course, we talked about triggers. And I do want to point out, not only should you document them well, but you also want to make sure that you turn them off when you don't need them, because if you're going to be migrating or updating GP, you certainly, if there's any table conversion, you don't want to have to worry about that. If you're in the business or of, let's say, importing a bunch of new vendors, you may not want to trigger any changes to or audits to another table while you're importing. Maybe you do, but if you don't, make sure you disable that trigger. Okay. All right. And then from a SQL standpoint, of course, you can do whatever you want in those triggers. Certainly, you got to test. Don't do anything without testing. And then you can put them into production when you are ready for them. Okay. But it's so easy to test first, and then rather than fix problems later because you did not test. So make sure you test. Okay. And if you have multiple companies, of course, those items do need to be created in all your companies. Okay. As well as we talked about a SQL view for the payroll activity tracking. Make sure that you create that same view in all your companies that have payroll. Okay. All right, some good commentary and some good questions here. All right. There was a question that somebody had in the chat window. I'll mention here verbally about that employment history inquiry. There is a column on the right called termination date. That date comes from the HR termination window. So if you're not in the habit of using the HR termination window to terminate employees, that termination date is not going to be populated. Okay? But if you go to cards, human resources, and termination, put in a term date, that's what goes into that termination field. All right. All right. So we have about 5 minutes. If anybody has any other questions, we'll get those answered. All right. I will say that if you do have any questions, of course, the internet is a wonderful place. Check out Twitter. Check out LinkedIn. There's so much information up there. It's mind-numbing sometimes. And also make sure you check out the Microsoft Service and Support blog as well, because there's plenty of information about GP coming from Microsoft. And you can also be notified when there are changes or new blogs. Okay. I get those all the time these days, it seems, from Microsoft. All right. So hopefully you guys have had a great 3 days if you've been able to attend a lot of the conference. And feel free to join us for conferences and such. And not conferences, webinars and such. So if you're interested in getting some GP webinars, I do those every month. So feel free to reach out for that. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining in.